family of Troy Anthony Davis and many supporters. But if we were doing a many-hour broadcast, I wasn't going to be speaking for myself. I needed to be interviewing people who were there. That is the point of independent media. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, where we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. And this is certainly one of those moments. And I said to the prison guards, I have to be able to broadcast near other people. I looked at the other elite journalists. They were far away. Why didn't they fight back too? Well, they were going to do 30-second or 1-minute broadcasts. They could fill that time. But we were going to be there for the long haul. We don't just give you the sound bite. We give you the whole meal. And so we were at an impasse until the truck, our satellite truck, pulled up. You know, when you're dealing with the big boys, you got to bring them in. And these guys came in to broadcast our show, who were hired by Fox perhaps the day before and CNN the next day. And we had hired them that day, and they were working for us. They came on the grounds, and they said, where do you want the truck, Miss Goodman? I said, well, actually, the guards are saying, where do you want the truck? I said, actually, over at that protest pen, and they just barreled through. And then they said, where do you want to stand? And I see the guards coming over, and I said, well, actually, and they said, where? I said, well, right here at the rope. And they handed me the mic and said, start broadcasting. And these guys who held the cameras formed a band around the broadcast, and we started at 6 o'clock. Now, I had the press packet from the Department of Corrections. It was very thin. It only said a few things. It started by talking about what Troy Anthony Davis would be doing on his last day of life. It said he would meet with family from 9 to 3, but they would have to clear out at 3 so that Mr. Davis could get a routine physical. Routine physical? Well, you know what happened a while ago in Texas. A man on death row attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital. They got him better, and then they executed him. Just down the road in a local church, Georgia's NAACP president of the chapter, spoke on the stage of the church and said, physical? So that they could make sure he's physically fit, so they can strap him down, so they can put the murder juice in his arm. Make no mistake, they call it an execution. We call it murder, the chapter president said. And then we were handed a press packet that focused mainly on what Troy Anthony Davis would have for his last meal. He had turned down the Last Supper of his choice. So he would be given the standard tray, as it's known. And they went into detail what the prison would feed him. They said grilled cheeseburgers, oven-browned potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw cookies, and a great beverage. It also listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. It was on a piece of paper, very big letters, each word on another line. Pentobarbital, the next line pancuronium bromide, the next line potassium chloride, and then Ativan in parentheses, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, the potassium chloride stops the heart. The only thing Davis could exert his own will over, the Last Supper and the sedative, he turned down. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis had lived. The chorus for clemency grew louder. Alan Alt, the former prison warden of this death row prison, said, don't execute Troy Anthony Davis, as did 5 former wardens of prisons across the country said don't. Even though they weren't opposed to the death penalty, they were opposed to it for Troy Anthony Davis. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53. A prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside, time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. You know how it works in an execution chamber. Witnesses sit behind a glass, and as the prisoner is about to be killed, the curtain is pulled back. There's the family of the murder victim, there is the people for the prisoner, and then there are the reporters. The AP reporter revealed what Troy Anthony Davis said in his last statement. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family and let you know, despite the situation you're in, I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I'm innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into the case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he looked at his executioners and said, "God have mercy on your souls. May God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Troy Anthony Davis' body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As I stood on the grounds about 1:15 just after Troy Davis was executed, the Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded what Gandhi reportedly answered when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." This was one of the movements that fueled Occupy Wall Street as well. And there were many. And this movement then caught on in city after city. What I am very concerned about, the evisceration of the encampments around the country and the level of mass crackdown on the protests. The militarization of police in this country should not be accepted. It is not good for the police. It is not good for civilians. It is not good for a democratic society. I had my own experience, the Democracy Now! Team did, with the police, as some of you know, in 2008 at the Republican convention. We had covered the Democrats in Denver, then flew to St. Paul. On the first day of that convention, it was Labor Day, beautiful blue sky day, and first we were covering the protests. We covered the anti-war protest that was largest that morning, 10,000 people marching for peace, led by soldiers, and that's so interesting. The level of resistance in the military is a large, untold story, because these people understand, they have seen war firsthand. So some in military uniform, they risked the most. Some were refusing to go to Afghanistan or back to Iraq, and some were going but were raising questions. Others refused to go altogether. And there were thousands of civilians of every walk of life, even delegates from inside the convention marched against war outside. And we were interviewing them, and then I went to the convention floor to interview delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. Remember, Sarah Palin had just been named a few days before. And there we were, doing these interviews, when I got a call from our senior producer, Mike Burke, who said, "Come quickly to 7th and Jackson. Sharif and Nicole have just been bloodied and arrested by police." I said, "What are you talking about?" "They are in the TV station digitizing tape." Mike said, "Just get there fast." We raced off the convention floor to 7th and Jackson. Riot police had fully contained the area. I went up to one of the officers and said, "You can see I've just come from the convention floor. I have the credentials that allow me to interview presidents, vice presidents, Congress members. They're the credentials that are bestowed by the authorities, like the police." And I said, we need to have our colleagues released. They have credentials like I do. Somehow they have been arrested. It wasn't seconds before the police ripped me through the line, twisted my arms back, slapped the handcuffs on, pushed me against a car, up against the wall and onto the ground, charging with a misdemeanor, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. But I am still desperately looking for Sharif and Nicole. Where are they? Nicole Salazar, a multimedia producer, and Sharif Abdel-Qaddous. He would later go on to cover the Egyptian Revolution, as you all well know. Even under Mubarak, he wasn't arrested, but he's arrested in the streets of the United States, covering a celebration of democracy, what the conventions are supposed to be. I see him across the parking lot. I demand to be brought to him. Finally, I am. We're standing with our handcuffs on, our credentials around our necks, demanding to be released, saying, you know we're reporters, whereupon the Secret Service ripped the credentials from around our necks. And then brought into the police van. There's Nicole. Her face is bleeding. She's got her credential on. She's handcuffed. I said, what happened? And she said, we were in the TV studio. We heard a commotion. We raced outside with camera and mic. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they hadn't left and gone to see what the trouble was. They saw protesters. They saw riot police. They saw this big parking lot. She stood against the parked cars, started filming, and then a phalanx of riot police came at her in formation. She didn't plan to film her own violent arrest, but that's exactly what happened. She's got camera in one hand, press pass in the other. As they shout, on your face, she shouts back, press, press. And they take her down. She didn't know what hit her, from behind and in front, slamming her down on her face. First thing to go, knee or boot in her back. Her camera tumbles down. They pull the battery out of her camera. If you were wondering what it was, they wanted to stop happening. And they are pulling her leg, so they are dragging her face through the gravel. Sharif is a very cool guy. He tells the rioting police to calm down. And they take him, they throw him against the wall, kick him twice in the chest, bloodying his arm, and take him down. They face PC felony riot charges. That's probable cause felony riot. I'm taken to the police garage where they've erected cages to put the protesters in, and Nicole and Sharif are taken to jail. It was because of the massive response to the video of our arrest that was put online immediately. Grassroots activism makes an enormous difference. We didn't know what was happening, but it was the most watched YouTube video of the first 2 days of the convention that ultimately we were released. First me, then Nicole and Sharif. Sharif was in a cell with an AP photographer. Sharif was released before him. You know, they arrested more than 40 reporters that week. And I was brought over to the convention center. This is the first night of the convention. The networks want to interview me. I'm in the NBC skybox, and after the interview, an NBC reporter comes over to me and says, why wasn't I arrested? The NBC reporter. I said, oh, were you outside covering the protest? And he said, no. I said, well, I don't get arrested in the skybox either. You see, as Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You've got to get out there. You know, it's our job to get on the convention floor, speak to the delegates, get into the corporate suites, see who's funding the Republican and Democratic conventions, and also get out onto the streets where the uninvited guests are. Sometimes thousands of them. And they have something important to say as well. Democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. Oh my God. So, the next day, the police chief holds a news conference saying how successful the police operation had been. We had just gotten Nicole out of the emergency room. We have this 2-hour broadcast to do every day. I go to the news conference, and the officer who let me into the news conference was my processing officer the night before. I said, you not only have to let me in, you have to let me out when this is done. And I asked Chief Harrington, raising my hand at the news conference, describe what happened to Sharif and to Nicole and to me, and said, how do you expect us to operate in this environment, and what have you instructed your police officers to do? He said we could embed with a mobile field force, embed. You know what he means, like embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. The next day I saw Fox reporters, Fox baseball cap, in the middle of a police organism moving down the streets. Embed. I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. I'm not saying reporters aren't brave who embed with troops in Afghanistan and did in Iraq. But what do you get from that perspective when you're eating with the troops, you're sleeping with the troops, your life is in their hands? You get the perspective at the trigger end of the war. If you're going to embed, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities, in Waziristan, where Code Pink is going tomorrow, where they are going to be at the target end with so many Pakistanis as the U.S. conducts a secret drone war in Pakistan, to call attention, to bring the media there, because so many people are terrorized there. Embed. If you're going to embed, send your reporters to embed, you need to embed in the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. The fact that the Pentagon calls the embedding process for reporters a spectacular success is precisely why it is a total failure. It is not only a violation of freedom of the press when reporters are beaten or arrested. It's a violation of your right to know, because if reporters are afraid to be there on the streets, it is more difficult for you to get information, to make the critical decisions about the most important issues of the day. My brother and I, David, wrote a book called Static, and we called it that because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality, when what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about President Obama's election. Oh, one thing, we did sue the Twin Cities authorities. We sued the police and the Secret Service who ripped the credentials around our necks. This was a multi-year process, and just last year we were brought in by the judge to Minneapolis to settle this case. We got a landmark settlement, a six-figure settlement, and also the agreement by the St. Paul Police that they would develop a protocol for how they deal with reporters. We then brought this message. We thought, where can we send the message to police about the unlawful arrests of reporters as well as unlawful arrests overall? Where would be the largest gathering of police? So we held our news conference at Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park, because we could be sure there would be hundreds of police there, and sent that message that this is not acceptable. Since 9/11, billions of dollars who've gone into local police departments. They have bought drones. They have bought tanks. The level of surveillance is suffocating a democratic society. They're certainly a threat. I urge you all to read a crusading series by Associated Press looking at the Muslim and Arab American community in this country in one police department, New York Police Department, that for years they've been surveilling and monitoring thousands of innocent civilians in their mosques, in their workplaces, in their businesses. Yet not one lead has come out of them. And they've gone from New York to New Jersey to Connecticut. At Yale University, the president issued a statement saying, "You have no right to surveil our students." New Jersey officials said, "What are you doing in New Jersey?" to the New York Police Department. In fact, I think it was a landlord who discovered that one of his apartment doors was open. He went inside, he saw all of this surveillance equipment. He called the police, but it was the police's surveillance equipment. We had on a young student from City University of New York who was named in the documents that AP got under the Freedom of Information Act. And his parents didn't want him to come on. They said, "Don't highlight our family. We don't want to be targeted." And he told his parents, "We're already targeted. I've been named. Our only protection is to be public." And so he came on the show. He was named in the documents because he and his friends had taken a camping trip over the weekend. And clearly an infiltrator was in that group, probably the guy who drove them. And everything they did on that weekend camping trip was written in the New York Police Department papers. And it said that these students were so extreme that they prayed 4 times a day. And he said this infiltrator was so stupid he didn't know we pray 5 times a day. But this is not good for a democratic society when populations feel under siege. They close in on themselves. They don't reach out. They don't reach out for help or talk about problems in their community. This is not good for national security. And you don't have to take it from me. Norm Stamper, the police chief of Seattle, who tried to stamp out the protests against the World Trade Organization in 1999 and hit the thousands of high school students and teachers and doctors and farmers and union leaders with tear gas and rubber bullets, and was forced out as a result. Hundreds of arrests. Chief Stamper said it was the worst mistake of his life. He said, don't use me as a model. We have set up a situation, a militarizing of police that is unacceptable in a democratic society. Now to November 2008, when President Obama was elected. I think the world heaved a sigh of relief. Now, I really do think people across the political spectrum understood, if for only on one issue, in this land with a legacy of slavery, that Barack Obama, the first African American to become president in this country, truly historic. And all of the movements that elected him, the anti-war movement. I mean, the main difference between Obama and Hillary Clinton, was that she supported the war in Iraq. He didn't. And she hung on to that support till the bitter end, until she saw she was going down, and then she backed off. And the environmental movement in this country saw hope with President Obama. The gay and lesbian movement in this country, the civil rights movement, all converged. But what happens when the community organizer-in-chief becomes the commander-in-chief? I mean, the good thing parents all over America were saying to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. But the problem is, who organizes then? And what do people do after that election? President Obama went on to scuttle climate change agreements at the global level in Copenhagen. He went on to preside over the longest war in U.S. history, granted, inherited from President Bush, but hasn't ended it through to this day. He is now responsible for the deportation of more immigrants than any president in history, and more espionage prosecutions of whistleblowers than all presidents combined. What do all those who elected him, who held out great hope for President Obama, do? Well, for one thing, I think people were tired after achieving what they achieved in 2008, but also losing their footing because they didn't want to contribute to a right-wing backlash, like the birther movement, questioning whether President Obama was born in the United States. Somehow he's some kind of other. And so what happens? Well, I think for a long time, people felt they had hit their heads against a brick wall. On that night in November when Barack Obama was elected, they felt that wall had become a door. The door had opened a crack. The question was, would it be kicked open or slammed shut? And that's not up to that one person in the White House. I mean, when those who are used to having the ear of the most powerful person on earth are sitting in the Oval Office with him and whispering their demands, if he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he is in big trouble. And that's when you agree with him. What about when you disagree? How are you going to make your demands heard? You know, democracy is not just accomplished on one day and then you can move on. Democracy is a process. And every day you must fight for it. You don't achieve it on any one day. And so where do these movements stand today? Very quickly, I know I was told 5 minutes, so I'll take a few more. When the Obamas went to the White House, before President Obama was inaugurated, remember when they were taken around by the Bushes to see their new residence? I was invited on CNN to comment on this historic moment. And I'm seeing them walk into the White House, and the pundits are chattering. You know, the pundits on all these networks who know so little about so much. much explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. So this is historic, and I say let's take pause. Look, Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama are about to enter the house they will live in with their daughters. Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama is the descendant of slaves from the Carolinas, which means their daughters, Malia and Sasha, are the descendants of slaves. They're about to live in the White House, the most famous house on earth, which was built by slaves. Let's just take pause. Then I thought of about a house a couple hours from here on the eastern shore of Maryland. Frederick Douglass was born there. I always tell this story, but it is so important. The greatest abolitionist in U.S. history. And it might not surprise you to know when he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager, he was a troublesome slave. And so he was handed to a man called a slave breaker. His name was Ed Covey. He was brought to his plantation called Mount Misery, and Covey beat him and tortured him there, but Frederick Douglass fought back, escaped, changed the world by going to the North, starting the North Star newspaper. Mount Misery, Covey's property, is today owned by Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it in 2003, the Secretary of Defense, he's living near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. When I heard that Mount Misery was Donald Rumsfeld's vacation home, I thought this needed to be investigated. Could this be true? Is it just, web lore? And as a journalist, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Now, I love coffee, and I go to this organic coffee shop in New York, an independent shop, an old brick building. On the outside, there's a plaque that says, Frederick Douglass, when he first came north, took refuge here in the printing press of a freed black man named David Ruggles, who had this printing press. And I thought about this. Frederick Douglass started the North Star newspaper. David Ruggles had a printing press because these men saw media as their form of liberation, of emancipation, because information is power. And so, as we headed down to St. Michael's, Maryland to investigate, when we came into town, I was actually coming to Washington an hour later to speak at Busboys and Poets. I just had very little time. I thought, oh my God, I don't know where Donald Rumsfeld lives, but I see an organic coffee shop ahead of me. And I said, they'll tell the truth. So we went inside. They said, what would you like? And I said, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives. And they said, oh, just go out the back. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down Mount Pleasant, make a right, another right. You'll hit Mount Misery. Go down the road, you'll hit Donald Rumsfeld's house. So we're on to something. We don't go down Mount Pleasant Road. We make a right and another right. It seemed we couldn't go right enough. But we did come to the end of the road. And there was the black tinted windows of the Secret Service SUV, and we knew we'd arrived. So I take out my video camera. I'm zooming in as they're zooming out. I'm wondering, does Secretary Rumsfeld understand the significance of this place, of Mount Misery? But sure enough, there's a stake in the ground next to the driveway that says Mount Misery. So we head off to an ancient black church down the road. It is Sunday morning, and folks are gathered in the sanctuary. And I ask an older woman who is the descendant of slaves, I said to her, this is an historic place. As you know, Frederick Douglass was born here, enslaved here. He was tortured at Mount Misery. Now Mount Misery is owned by Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who's known for torture. What do you make of this? And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. So I headed up to speak in Rochester, New York, at a university. And afterwards, a young woman student said, can I take you to Mount Hope Cemetery, where Frederick Douglass is buried? I said, oh my God, I'm flying off in the morning at 6 o'clock to Denver. She said, I'll meet you at 4. We're in the middle of a snowstorm. So I meet her. And we brush off the snowflakes of Frederick Douglass's tombstone. And then she begs me, come across the cemetery. I have one more tombstone to show you. And we walk across, and there is the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist, feminist, and they were not just allies, they were friends. Frederick Douglass was a great feminist. He seconded the women's right to vote resolution at the 1848